I still remember the day I first realized money meant more to my parents than love. It was a crisp autumn morning in Greenwich, Connecticut, where our sprawling colonial mansion sat behind wrought iron gates that kept the world at arm's length. I was 7, clutching a report card with straight A's, practically bouncing with excitement to show my mother. But when I found her in her study, she barely glanced up from her iPad, muttering something about how anything less would have been unacceptable anyway. That moment planted a seed that would grow into a forest of doubt and pain over the next 30 years. My childhood in that pristine house on Maple Avenue was a masterclass in conditional love, where every achievement was measured against the expectations of New England's elite social circle. My father, Richard, was a hedge fund manager who treated his family like another investment portfolio, expecting maximum returns on minimal emotional investment. My mother, Elizabeth, spent more time planning charity galas than actually talking to her children. Growing up, I learned to navigate their world of garden parties and private school fundraisers, where appearances meant everything and genuine emotions were treated like unwelcome guests. My sister Caroline adapted better than I did, learning early to smile prettily and say all the right things. But I was always the difficult one, asking uncomfortable questions about why we needed 3 vacation homes when my best friend's family had lost theirs in the 2008 crash. I tried to break free from their influence when I went to college, choosing a public university in California instead of the ivy-covered walls they'd selected for me. That's where I met Tom, a kind-hearted elementary school teacher who saw me for who I was, not for my family's net worth. We fell in love, got married despite my parents' thinly veiled disapproval, and started building a life based on what really mattered. When our daughter Emily was born, I thought maybe things would change. Surely a grandchild would soften their hearts, show them what truly matters in life. For a while, it seemed to work. They sent expensive gifts, showed up for her first birthday with a photographer in tow for the perfect social media moment. But it was all surface level, just like everything else in their world. Then came the diagnosis that shattered our world. Emily was 4 when the doctors found the rare genetic condition. The treatment existed, a new gene therapy that had shown promising results in clinical trials. But the cost was astronomical, and our insurance wouldn't cover an experimental treatment. $100,000 stood between my daughter and a chance at a normal life. I remember sitting in our modest living room in Oakland, hands shaking as I dialed my parents' number. The house they lived in was worth millions. The art on their walls could have paid for Emily's treatment 10 times over. I told myself they would help. They had to help. This was their grandchild's life we were talking about. The conversation plays on repeat in my mind, every word etched into my memory like acid on metal. My mother's voice was cool, detached, as if I was asking for money to start a business venture rather than save her granddaughter's life. "Jennifer, darling, you have to think about this rationally. There's no guarantee this treatment will even work. Sometimes we have to accept that things happen for a reason." My father chimed in with concerns about setting a precedent, about teaching responsibility and self-reliance. The same man who had spent more on a single bottle of wine than most families made in a month was lecturing me about fiscal responsibility while my daughter's future hung in the balance. I sat there, phone pressed against my ear, listening to them talk about investment portfolios and responsible planning, about how they couldn't just throw money at every problem. Each word was another brick in the wall between us, another confirmation that their world of wealth and status had corrupted something fundamental in their souls. That evening, after hanging up the phone, I watched Emily playing with her dolls on the living room floor. She had no idea about the conversation that had just taken place, no understanding of how her grandparents had just valued their financial principles over her well-being. She looked up at me with her bright blue eyes, my mother's eyes, ironically, and smiled that innocent smile that made everything else in the world fade away. Tom found me later that night, crying in our bedroom. He held me as I poured out every bitter memory, every moment of conditional love and emotional neglect that had led to this point. He understood better than anyone how my parents' wealth had become a poison in our family, corrupting every genuine emotion with calculations of cost and benefit. The days that followed were a blur of desperate research, of reaching out to every possible source of help. We started a GoFundMe campaign, reached out to medical charities, even considered selling our house. All while my parents continued their life of luxury, posting pictures on social media of their latest vacation in the Maldives, completely unbothered by the fact that their granddaughter's future was hanging by a thread. The weight of their rejection settled into my bones, transforming from sharp pain into a dull, constant ache. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about finally seeing, with absolute clarity, the true nature of my relationship with my parents. Every childhood memory was recolored by this new understanding, every past interaction revealed for what it truly was, a transaction rather than an expression of love. In those dark days, as I watched Emily sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm raging around her, something inside me began to change. The hurt and disappointment began to crystallize into something harder, something that would eventually drive me to actions I never thought myself capable of. But in that moment, all I could feel was the crushing weight of betrayal and the growing certainty that something had to give. The weeks following my parents' rejection were a blur of desperate attempts and sleepless nights. I couldn't accept their decision as final, not when Emily's life hung in the balance. Every morning, I'd wake up early, watching the sun rise over the Oakland Hills through our kitchen window, mentally rehearsing new ways to approach them, new arguments that might finally break through their wall of indifference. I tried calling my mother first, catching her during her regular Thursday morning tennis session at the Greenwich Country Club. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can we talk about Emily's treatment again?" I could hear the subtle sounds of her walking away from the courts, her tennis shoes squeaking on the polished floors of the clubhouse. "Jennifer, we've been through this," she sighed, that familiar note of irritation creeping into her voice. "Your father and I have made our position clear. We can't just throw money at every problem that comes up. What about your brother Michael's children? If we help you, we'd have to help them too if anything came up." The mention of Michael sent a surge of anger through me. Michael, the golden child, whose kids had college funds larger than most people's mortgages. "Mom, this isn't about setting precedents or being fair. This is about Emily's life, your granddaughter's life." But she had already shifted the conversation, talking about some charity gala she was planning, as if my daughter's future was just another item on her social calendar to be checked off and forgotten. I hung up feeling hollow, the taste of defeat bitter in my mouth. Next, I tried my father at his office in Manhattan. His secretary, Janet, who'd known me since I was a child, sounded apologetic as she put me through. "I'm sorry, Jenny," she whispered. "He's been in a mood all week." "Dad," I started when he finally picked up, "I need you to really listen to me." I launched into a detailed explanation of Emily's condition, the success rates of the treatment, the doctor's recommendations, all the research I'd spent weeks compiling. I even had spreadsheets showing how we could repay them over time, though the idea of treating my daughter's life-saving treatment as a loan made me sick to my stomach. His response was like a carefully crafted press release, devoid of emotion or real engagement. "Jennifer, I understand you're upset, but you need to think about this logically. Have you considered that sometimes these things happen for a reason? Maybe this is an opportunity for you and Tom to learn about financial planning and responsibility." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "A reason? Dad, she's 4 years old. What possible lesson could be worth risking her life?" The conversation devolved from there, with my father falling back on his favorite lectures about self-reliance and the importance of making tough decisions. Each word felt like another brick in the wall between us, another confirmation that the wealthy world they inhabited had corrupted something fundamental in their souls. I tried different approaches over the next few days. I sent emails with attachments from Emily's doctors, explaining the urgency of starting treatment soon. I reached out to my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister, hoping she might be able to talk some sense into them. I even swallowed my pride and asked if they would consider it a loan with interest, anything to get them to help. Tom watched all this with growing concern. He found me one night at our small dining room table, surrounded by medical papers and loan applications, my laptop open to yet another crowdfunding website. "Jen," he said softly, placing his hands on my shoulders, "maybe it's time to accept that they're not going to help." But I couldn't accept it. Not yet. I drove up to their house in Greenwich one weekend, Emily in tow, hoping that seeing her, spending time with her, might spark some genuine emotion in them. We arrived unannounced, the only way to ensure they couldn't manufacture an excuse to be out. The house was exactly as I remembered it, imposing, perfect, cold. Emily ran ahead of me up the manicured path, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. My mother opened the door, surprise quickly masked by her practiced social smile. "Jennifer, darling." What an unexpected surprise. We spent an awkward afternoon in their formal living room, Emily playing with the expensive decorative pillows while I made one last attempt to reach whatever humanity might still exist beneath their polished exterior. I showed them videos of Emily's good days, told them about her dreams of becoming a ballet dancer, tried to make them see her as a person rather than a problem to be managed. My father sat in his leather armchair, barely looking up from his phone. My mother fluttered around, offering expensive cookies and making small talk about anything except what really mattered. When Emily started dancing around the room, showing off the moves she'd learned in her ballet class, I saw something flicker in my mother's eyes, a brief moment of genuine connection. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual careful mask of polite interest. "She's certainly energetic," my mother observed, smoothing her perfectly pressed slacks. "Have you considered that maybe this condition isn't as serious as the doctors are making it out to be? After all, she seems fine now." That was the moment something inside me snapped. The careful facade I'd been maintaining cracked, and years of suppressed anger and hurt came pouring out. "Fine now? Do you want to wait until she's not fine? Until it's too late to do anything? What kind of grandparents are you?" Emily stopped dancing, startled by my outburst. My father finally looked up from his phone, his face hardening. "I think it's time for you to leave, Jennifer. When you're ready to discuss this rationally, without emotional manipulation, we can talk." Emotional manipulation. Those words echoed in my head as I drove home that night, Emily sleeping peacefully in her car seat. The irony of being accused of manipulation by the masters of emotional control themselves was almost too much to bear. As I watched the highway lines blur through my tears, something shifted inside me. The desperate need to make them understand, to win their approval and help, began to transform into something darker and more determined. That night, after putting Emily to bed, I sat in our backyard, listening to the distant sounds of the city. The cool California air was so different from the stiff, formal atmosphere of my parents' world. As I watched the fog roll in over the hills, I made a decision. If they couldn't be moved by love and reason, perhaps they needed to learn about consequences in a language they would understand. The thought should have frightened me, but instead, it brought a strange sense of calm. The time for pleading was over. The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope, embossed with gold lettering and wrapped in a silk ribbon. Even the paper screamed excess. Michael's wedding to Charlotte, the daughter of a prominent Boston banking family, was to be the social event of the season. The date was set for early June at the historic Rosecliff Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, because, apparently, our family's Greenwich estate wasn't quite grand enough for the occasion. I almost threw the invitation away, but Tom convinced me we should go. "Emily would love to be a flower girl," he said softly, always the voice of reason. "And maybe seeing all their friends and family might make your parents reconsider." I knew better, but I agreed anyway. Looking back, I think part of me needed to witness their excess firsthand, to confirm what I already knew about their warped priorities. The week before the wedding, I overheard my mother on the phone with her event planner while I was visiting with Emily. The numbers they were throwing around made me physically ill. $20,000 for flowers alone, $43,000 for the catering, $105,000 for the venue and decoration, the string quartet from New York, the vintage champagne, the ice sculptures, each detail more extravagant than the last. The total kept climbing until it reached $243,000, more than twice what Emily's treatment would cost. I watched Emily playing in their garden that afternoon, chasing butterflies among my mother's prize roses. She tired more quickly these days, her breathing becoming labored after just a few minutes of running. The contrast between her struggling form and the excessive spending happening inside the house was almost too much to bear. The wedding day itself was a masterclass in conspicuous consumption. Rosecliff's sprawling lawns were transformed into something out of a fairy tale, with white garden roses and peonies everywhere you looked. Champagne flowed freely from crystal fountains, and uniformed waiters circulated with endless trays of delicacies that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. I stood in the grand ballroom, wearing the designer dress my mother had insisted on buying me. "We can't have you looking out of place, darling," watching guests arrive in their Bentleys and Maybachs. Each new face represented another member of their privileged circle, another potential witness to their social triumph. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the particular brand of forced laughter that seems unique to the upper class. Michael was in his element, greeting guests with that easy charm he'd inherited from our father. His bride Charlotte floated around in a custom-made gown that probably cost as much as a small car. They looked perfect together, two products of privilege preparing to create their own dynasty of wealth and status. Emily was beautiful in her flower girl dress, scattering rose petals down the aisle with precision that made my mother beam with pride. "See how well she can perform when she puts her mind to it?" my mother whispered to her friend Margaret. "Jennifer worries too much about her condition." I dug my nails into my palms until I felt the skin break. The ceremony was followed by a reception that seemed designed to set new records for ostentation. The 5-tier wedding cake was adorned with edible gold leaf. A famous jazz band had been flown in from New Orleans. There was even a fireworks display scheduled for midnight, because apparently no expense could be spared for Michael's special day. I found myself stationed near the open bar, nursing a glass of $1,000-a-bottle champagne that tasted like ash in my mouth. From this vantage point, I could watch the whole spectacle unfold. My father giving a speech about family values and the importance of building a legacy. My mother dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief as she talked about the joy of seeing her son marry into such a suitable family. The real sucker punch came during the father-daughter dance. As my father twirled Charlotte around the floor to the strains of "The Way You Look Tonight," I overheard him tell her, "You're the daughter we always dreamed of." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here was my father, who had refused to spend money to save his actual granddaughter's life, lavishing praise and acceptance on his new daughter-in-law simply because she came from the right social circle. Tom found me in the garden later, hiding behind a towering arrangement of white orchids. He didn't say anything, just held me while I shook with silent rage. Emily had fallen asleep in a little nest of cushions in the bridal suite, exhausted from the day's activities. Even in sleep, her breathing was slightly labored, a constant reminder of what my parents were choosing to ignore. As the evening wore on, I watched my mother flit from group to group, accepting compliments on the stunning affair she had orchestrated. Each time someone praised the extravagance of the event, I mentally calculated how many months of Emily's treatment that particular element could have covered. The ice sculpture? 3 weeks. The vintage champagne? 2 months. The flowers? Almost 5 months. Near midnight, as the fireworks illuminated the Newport sky in bursts of gold and silver, I stood apart from the crowd, my mind racing with possibilities. The event planner's clipboard, carelessly left on a table, showed the final tally of expenses in neat, itemized rows. $243,000 spent on a single day of celebration while my daughter's future hung in the balance. Something crystallized in me during those moments under the exploding sky. I thought about all the times I had tried to play by their rules, to be the dutiful daughter they wanted. I thought about Emily's brave smile during her last doctor's appointment, about Tom's quiet strength as we faced rejection after rejection from insurance companies and medical foundations. The last firework faded from the sky, leaving behind a trail of smoke and the echoing cheers of the gathered guests. In that darkness, I made a decision. The time for accepting their choices was over. If they could spend nearly $250,000 on a party while denying their granddaughter a chance at life, then they had forfeited any right to my compliance with their warped value system. As the guests began to depart, climbing into their luxury cars with gift bags worth thousands, I stayed behind, watching the cleanup crew begin to dismantle the evidence of this obscene display of wealth. My mother found me there, still riding high on the success of her social triumph. "Wasn't it just perfect, darling?" she gushed, adjusting her diamond necklace. Everyone will be talking about this for months. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not my mother, but a stranger who had lost touch with what truly mattered in life. "Yes, mother," I replied, my voice steady. "Everyone will certainly remember this." The double meaning in my words was lost on her, but I felt their weight settle into my bones, a promise of things to come. 3 weeks after Michael's wedding, I sat in our Oakland home's small home office, surrounded by medical bills and wedding photos I'd downloaded from the photographer's website. Each image of champagne towers and ice sculptures felt like a personal insult, a reminder of my parents' twisted priorities. The numbers danced before my eyes, $243,000 for a party, while $100,000 to save their granddaughter's life was deemed too expensive. The transformation from desperate mother to avenging daughter didn't happen overnight. It started small, with me spending late nights after Emily was asleep, meticulously documenting every instance of my parents' neglect and excess. I created a spreadsheet tracking their public donations to various charities, always to organizations that would put their names on buildings or invite them to glamorous galas. Never to the small, local charities that actually helped people in need. Tom noticed the change in me. He'd find me at the computer at 3 in the morning, poring over old family photos, financial records, anything I could find that proved the pattern of their behavior. "Jen," he'd say, his voice gentle but worried, "maybe you should get some sleep." But sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when every day brought Emily closer to the point where treatment might no longer be effective. I started attending my parents' social events again, but with different eyes. At each charity gala or country club dinner, I watched them perform their roles as philanthropic pillars of society. I recorded every conversation on my phone, noted every boast about their latest expensive purchase or charitable donation. Each piece of evidence was another log on the fire of my fury. One particular evening at the Greenwich Country Club became the tipping point. I overheard my mother in the ladies' room, talking to her friend Barbara about Emily's condition. "Of course we'd love to help," she was saying, "but you have to draw the line somewhere. Jennifer needs to learn that she can't always come running to mommy and daddy to solve her problems." I stood in that marble-lined bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white, listening to them discuss my daughter's life as if it were a teaching moment. Barbara's sympathetic clucking sounds mixed with the soft classical music playing overhead, creating a surreal soundtrack to my mother's casual cruelty. That night, I drove home along the dark Connecticut highways, my mind racing faster than my car. Every memory of their neglect, every dismissive comment, every cold rejection crystallized into something hard and sharp in my chest. The desperate sadness that had been my constant companion for months began to transform into something else, something that felt dangerously like power. I started making plans. Not the kind of plans you share with anyone, not even your husband. I spent hours researching their financial holdings, their social connections, their carefully curated public image. My background in marketing, a career they dismissed as beneath our family status, suddenly became useful in ways I'd never imagined. Emily's worsening condition only fueled my resolve. Each time she had to stop playing to catch her breath, every night I heard her coughing in her sleep, I added another detail to my plan. I knew their weaknesses, their pressure points, the carefully hidden skeletons in our family's luxurious closets. Years of observing them navigate their social world had taught me exactly how their game was played. I set up a separate email account at a local library, using it to gather information and make connections that would prove useful later. I reached out to former household staff, old business associates who'd been pushed aside, anyone who might have their own reasons for resenting my parents' casual cruelty. Many were eager to share stories, to provide details that would help bring down the mighty Hairston family. The real breakthrough came when Janet, my father's longtime secretary, sent me a USB drive containing years of private correspondence and financial records. "I'm retiring next month anyway," her note read. "And I've watched them hurt too many people." The drive contained evidence of tax evasion, questionable business dealings, and private emails that would shatter their carefully maintained public image. My home office became a command center of sorts. I covered one wall with a timeline of their offenses, connecting strings between various events and people like a detective in a crime movie. Tom would peek in occasionally, concern evident in his eyes, but he never asked what I was doing. Maybe he didn't want to know, or maybe he understood that some things need to be done alone. I started testing the waters, sending anonymous emails to some of their social circle with hints about certain indiscretions. The ripples were immediate. Subtle changes in how people treated them at social events, whispered conversations that stopped when they entered rooms. My mother called me one evening, unusually agitated, asking if I'd heard any strange rumors circulating about the family. "No, Mother," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Is something wrong?" "Of course not," she snapped. "Everything's perfect. Just perfect." But I could hear the worry in her voice, the first crack in her perfect facade. Late at night, when the house was quiet except for the humming of my laptop, I sometimes questioned what I was becoming. Was I any better than them, plotting revenge while they slept in their mansion, unaware of the storm gathering on their horizon? But then I'd hear Emily cough in her sleep, or notice how her clothes were getting looser as the condition took its toll, and my resolve would harden again. I kept a photo on my desk, not of my parents or their mansion, but of Emily on her first day of preschool, her smile bright and untroubled by illness. That photo became my touchstone, my reminder of why I was walking this dark path. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about showing them that their actions had consequences. The power I felt growing inside me was different from their kind of power. Theirs came from money and social status, from the ability to buy influence and loyalty. Mine came from truth, from the righteous anger of a mother protecting her child, from the accumulated weight of years of their casual cruelty. As my plan took shape, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The frantic energy of those first weeks of planning gave way to a cold, focused determination. I no longer cried myself to sleep or spent hours raging at their injustice. Instead, I channeled every emotion into action, every memory of hurt into another piece of my strategy. 3 weeks after that night at the country club, I sat in my office, looking at the wall of evidence I'd assembled. Everything was in place. The emails were drafted, the documents organized, the witnesses ready to speak. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of dismantling the carefully constructed world my parents had built around themselves. I touched Emily's photo one last time before turning off my desk lamp. "This is for you, baby," I whispered into the darkness. Sometimes justice has to be taken, not asked for. The morning I chose to begin was unseasonably cold for Greenwich. I remember watching the fog roll in from Long Island Sound, shrouding my parents' mansion in a fitting gloom. I'd chosen this day carefully. It was their annual Charity Foundation board meeting, where they would be surrounded by the social elite they so desperately wanted to impress. I arrived early, dressed in the kind of understated designer outfit my mother always preferred. The security guard at the gate, Mike, waved me through with a friendly smile. He'd known me since I was a child, and I felt a twinge of guilt knowing that his pension fund was one of the many things my father had mismanaged over the years, information that would soon become public knowledge. The house was already bustling with staff preparing for the meeting. My mother's event coordinator, Sarah, was directing the placement of flower arrangements in the main hall. "Jennifer." "What a surprise," she said, her eyes widening slightly. She knew as well as anyone that I hadn't attended one of these meetings in years. "I thought it was time to take a more active role in the family foundation," I replied, the lie rolling smoothly off my tongue. The foundation, their pride and joy, their ticket to social respectability, would be the first domino to fall. I made my way to my father's study, ostensibly to wait for the meeting to begin. The room still smelled of leather and expensive cigars, unchanged since my childhood. Family photos lined the walls: Michael's graduation from Harvard, my parents at various charity galas, even a few carefully curated shots of Emily from when she was a baby. None from after her diagnosis, of course. As board members began arriving, I watched from the window as their luxury cars pulled up the circular driveway. Barbara Wilson in her Mercedes, Robert Chin in his Bentley, all the carefully chosen members of my parents' social circle. Each of them would soon learn exactly what kind of people they'd allied themselves with. The meeting began at 10 a.m. sharp. My mother sat at the head of the long mahogany table, perfectly coiffed and radiating false warmth. My father stood beside her, ready to present their annual report of the Foundation's activities. I took my seat quietly, opening my laptop as if to take notes. Instead, I pressed send on the first of several carefully crafted email chains. By the time my father reached the third slide of his presentation about the Foundation's charitable works, phones around the table began to buzz. I watched as faces changed from polite attention to confusion, then concern, then barely concealed shock. Barbara was the first to exclaim out loud, her face pale as she looked at her phone. "Richard, Elizabeth, what is this about the Jensen Memorial Hospital wing?" The hospital wing, their crowning charitable achievement, had been built with misappropriated foundation funds, as the documents I'd just released clearly showed. My father faltered in his presentation, but before he could respond, more phones chimed. Robert Chen stood up abruptly, his face ashen. "The scholarship fund. These numbers can't be right." But they were right, and he knew it. The prestigious scholarship fund that bore their name had been systematically drained to cover their personal expenses for years. My mother's perfect mask began to crack as she realized what was happening. Her eyes met mine across the table, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear there. "Jennifer," she started, but I cut her off by pressing send on the next batch of emails. This time, it wasn't just financial documents. It was personal correspondence, evidence of their social manipulations, the cruel calculations behind their every charitable act. The emails showed how they'd blackballed families from their social circle, how they'd used their influence to hurt those who crossed them, how they'd laughed about denying help to their own granddaughter while spending fortunes on maintaining their social status. "These are private family matters," my father tried to say, but his voice shook. He knew as well as I did that there was no coming back from this. The carefully constructed facade of their lives was crumbling in real time. I stood up slowly, my laptop closed. "Private family matters?" I said, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Like how you spent nearly $250,000 on Michael's wedding while refusing to help save your granddaughter's life. Like how you've been embezzling from your own charitable foundation while pretending to be philanthropists." The room erupted into chaos. Board members were making calls, gathering their things, practically running for the doors. My mother sat frozen in her chair, her perfect makeup unable to hide the pallor of her skin. My father's hands were shaking as he tried to gather the papers from his presentation, as if that could somehow undo what had just happened. But I wasn't done. As the room cleared out, I launched the final phase of my plan. Emails went out to every major news outlet in the tri-state area, to the IRS, to the state attorney general's office. Years of careful documentation, witness statements, financial records, everything needed to ensure that this wasn't just a social embarrassment, but a complete dismantling of their world. "Why?" my mother whispered, finally finding her voice. "How could you do this to your own family?" I walked over to where she sat, leaning down so we were eye to eye. "Family?" I said quietly. "You lost the right to that word when you decided your social status was worth more than your granddaughter's life." My father tried to bluster, to threaten. "We'll cut you off completely," he said, his voice trying to find its old authority. "You'll never see a penny of your inheritance." I laughed then, and the sound seemed to frighten them more than anything else had. "Do you really think I care about your money anymore? This isn't about inheritance. This is about justice." As I walked out of that room, I could hear my mother starting to cry, my father making frantic phone calls to their lawyers. But it was too late. Within hours, their phones would be ringing off the hook with reporters seeking comments. Their carefully curated social media accounts would be flooded with questions and accusations. Their friends, if they could be called that, would be distancing themselves as quickly as possible. I drove home through the fog, feeling neither triumph nor regret. The weight I'd carried for so long had transformed into something else, not happiness exactly, but a sense of completion. I'd done what needed to be done, not just for Emily, but for every person they'd ever hurt with their casual cruelty and calculated indifference. Tom was waiting when I got home, Emily asleep on his lap while he watched the news. The story was already breaking, spreading across local channels and social media. He didn't ask if I was responsible. He just held me while I watched our world, and my parents' world, change irrevocably. That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked me why I seemed different. "You look stronger, Mommy," she said sleepily. I kissed her forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "I am stronger, baby," I whispered. "And tomorrow's going to be a better day." The weeks following my parents' downfall passed in a blur of news reports, legal proceedings, and uncomfortable phone calls. Our modest home in Oakland became a fortress against the storm of media attention, with reporters camping out on our street hoping to get the inside story of the Hairston family scandal. Tom handled them with quiet dignity, politely but firmly turning away interview requests while I focused on what mattered most, Emily's treatment. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took destroying my parents' reputation to finally get Emily the help she needed. An anonymous donor, likely someone looking to distance themselves from my parents' scandal, offered to cover the full cost of her treatment. The same social circles that had once enabled my parents' behavior were now falling over themselves to show how different they were, how much more compassionate. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room during Emily's first treatment session, watching CNN run yet another story about the Hairston Foundation scandal. The numbers were staggering: millions in misappropriated funds, years of tax evasion, dozens of families affected by their schemes. My mother's face flashed across the screen, no longer perfectly composed as she pushed through a crowd of reporters outside their lawyer's office. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from old family friends and distant relatives, some expressing shock and disappointment, others offering support, many just fishing for more gossip. I ignored most of them. The only message I responded to was from Janet, my father's former secretary. "You did what needed to be done." Some birds need their gilded cages broken before they can see the damage they've caused. Michael, my brother, tried to play mediator. He showed up at our house one Sunday morning, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes instead of his usual bespoke suits. "There are parents, Jenny," he said, sitting stiffly on our worn living room couch. "Whatever they did, they don't deserve this." I let him talk, watching Emily play with her dolls in the corner. Her breathing was already easier after just 2 treatments. "Deserve," I finally said. "What did Emily deserve, Michael? What did all those families whose lives they ruined deserve?" He left without answering, and I haven't heard from him since. The legal consequences came swiftly. My father faced federal charges for tax evasion and embezzlement. My mother, while not directly implicated in the financial crimes, was forced to resign from every charitable board and social organization she'd once dominated. Their carefully constructed world of influence and prestige crumbled like a sand castle at high tide. But victory, if that's what it was, tasted different than I'd expected. Some nights, I'd lie awake wondering about the collateral damage of my actions. The foundation's legitimate charitable works had to be suspended. Employees who'd known nothing about the corruption lost their jobs. The ripple effects touched lives I'd never intended to disturb. Tom found me one night sitting in our backyard, staring at the stars barely visible through the Oakland fog. He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat beside me in silence. Finally, he asked the question I'd been asking myself. "Do you regret it?" I thought about Emily's improving health, about the other families coming forward with their own stories of my parents' cruelty, about the strange liberation of finally standing up to decades of emotional manipulation. "No," I answered honestly, "but I'm not the same person I was before." The truth was, executing vengeance had changed me in ways I was still discovering. The daughter who had desperately sought her parents' approval was gone, replaced by someone stronger, but also harder. I had become capable of things I never thought possible, and that knowledge was both empowering and frightening. Emily, in her innocent wisdom, helped keep me grounded. One afternoon, as we walked home from her dance class, something she could now do without getting winded, she asked about her grandparents. "Are they bad people, Mommy?" I stopped walking, kneeling down to her level on the busy Oakland sidewalk. "No, sweetie," I said after a moment. "They're people who forgot what's really important." Sometimes grown-ups get so focused on having things that they forget about loving people. The hardest part wasn't the media attention or the legal battles. It was explaining to my daughter why her grandparents had chosen money and status over her well-being. How do you tell a child that some people, even family, can become so twisted by wealth and privilege that they lose sight of basic humanity? 6 months after the scandal broke, I received a letter from my mother. The handwriting was shaky, nothing like her usual confident script. She wrote about regret, about sleepless nights, about finally seeing the truth of what they'd become. Part of me wanted to believe her, but I'd learned to be wary of easy redemption. I wrote back a simple response: "Emily's doing better. Her treatment is working." That's all that matters now. I included a recent photo of Emily at her dance recital, healthy and smiling. No accusations, no anger. Just the evidence of what their money could have accomplished if they'd chosen differently. The scandal eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories of corruption and greed. My parents retreated to their house in the Hamptons. Their social circle dramatically reduced, their influence evaporated. I heard through Janet that my father had started seeing a therapist, something he'd always dismissed as weakness. My mother reportedly took up gardening, working with her hands for the first time in her life. As for me, I found myself transformed in unexpected ways. The anger that had driven me for so long gradually gave way to something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of peace. I channeled my experience into helping other families navigate the healthcare system, offering support to parents facing similar battles with insurance companies and medical bureaucracy. Tom and I started a small foundation of our own, focusing on helping families cover medical treatments that insurance wouldn't. We named it after Emily, but unlike my parents' foundation, we kept it simple and transparent. No galas, no social climbing, just direct help to people who needed it. Emily continued to improve, her condition responding well to the treatment. Watching her twirl in her ballet classes or run through the park without getting winded, I knew that every difficult choice, every dark moment of planning, had been worth it. She would grow up knowing that she was valued not for her social status or her family name, but for herself. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the fog rolls in from the bay, I think about the girl I used to be, the one who desperately sought her parents' approval, who tried to play by their rules even as those rules crushed her spirit. She seems like a stranger now, as distant as the world of wealth and privilege I left behind. The last time I drove past our old family home in Greenwich, the gates were closed and weeds were starting to grow in the once perfect gardens. It was a fitting metaphor for the fall of the mighty Harriston family. But from those weeds, something new and possibly better might grow, if not in this generation, then perhaps in the next. I've learned that true justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about breaking down the walls we've built around our hearts, about forcing people to face the consequences of their choices. My parents lost their social standing and their carefully constructed image, but maybe, just maybe, they gained something more valuable, the chance to see themselves clearly for the first time. As for me, I found strength I never knew I had, and a kind of peace I never expected to find. The price of that peace was high, higher than any number my parents could have written on a check. But looking at Emily's healthy smile, hearing her laugh echo through our modest home, I know it was worth every difficult step of the journey.